All right, let's be making our way in our Bibles over to 2 Samuel chapter 11, where we left off last week with verse 6. Now, today we are going to, again, continue looking at the story of David and Bathsheba. And more so, at least at this point, in what we're looking at this morning, looking at the relationship between David and Uriah. So the context is important here. David, or at least the Israelites, have been fighting against the Ammonites and the Syrians, as we saw in chapter 10. However, when we come to chapter 11, this account that we read about in chapter 11 takes place at the same time as the children of Israel are fighting against the Ammonites, against the Ammonite capital of Rabbah. Now, moving forward in the book of 2 Samuel, you start to see some flaws or some cracks in David's leadership or David's administration. And really, up to this point, when you look at the book of if you look at the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, David has always, for the most part, has been portrayed in a pretty positive light. He's made, for the most part, he's made all the right decisions. He's shown success. Israel has benefited from the success of David. And now, moving forward, we start to read that David basically has some chinks in his armor, so to speak. He's not morally invincible, we could say. And really, when you think about why does the writer of 2 Samuel at this point include these accounts in David's life moving forward, it's just a reminder to us that at the end of the day, everybody is guilty. Everybody can fall victim to the problem of sin. It doesn't matter how high of regard that you hold somebody, as certainly most of the Jews moving forward, especially during the time of Jesus, they held David in such a high regard. It doesn't matter what your status is, doesn't matter in how high of a regard that you are held. At the end of the day, everybody falls victim to the problem of sin. Look for a moment at Psalm chapter 53. Specifically looking at the first three verses, Psalm 53, beginning in verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, "There is no God. They are corrupt and have done abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. God looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. Every one of them has turned aside. They have together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one." Now, you might think in this particular passage that if you notice there the superscription at the beginning of this psalm, this was written by David, you might be thinking that David is perhaps talking about perhaps David's talking about a very wicked nation that he's had to deal with. But keep in mind that Paul would later quote from this in the book of Romans with this very same idea to the Christians that he's writing to that perhaps had a Jewish background, reminding them that just as David said, "There is none who does good," Paul applies that in the book of Romans to even the Israelites before the law of Christ. They were still under the problem of sin. And certainly we know that David fell victim to sin, first of all, because of what we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Again, part of what we saw last week, that David, of course, fathers a child with a woman that was married to another man. He committed adultery. So, when we look at verse 6, David's at a position now where, in his mind, he needs to cover up this sin. He needs to find some way to basically distance himself from Bathsheba because obviously the signs, the results of the sin are soon to follow, or soon to appear. So verse 6, David in his mind thinks, well, we need to do something about Uriah in this context. So verse 6, then David sent to Joab, saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. Now, remember that in this context, Uriah and the other Israelites are fighting against the Ammonites. And perhaps in this point, because David is talking to Joab, Uriah is part of the Israelite force that is battling the Syrians, which, remember, they are the more well-trained, more talented soldier, so to speak. So to call forth Uriah away from the battle, and in particular, if he's working under the leadership of Joab, to pull him away from battling the strongest army of the two opponents, pretty big deal. But this sometimes could happen. So David sends to Joab, wanting Uriah to come back to see David. Now, keep in mind, something to keep in mind in this passage. Remember that in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when Israel begged and pleaded with Samuel to get a king, that Samuel actually gave them sort of like a warning about, you want a king, but at the end of the day, what you want and what you will get may not always be the same thing. You might get a really strong, benevolent leader like David was for most of his time as king, but Samuel also pointed out that the king will be able to take certain things from you. And in 1 Samuel 8, you see taking the young men to make them his servants, livestock that he would take and make his own. But nowhere in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and if you go back and you look at all the things that the king would take, nowhere did you see this concept of that a king would have the right to take another man's wife. Because, of course, that is a violation of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And so David, even though he is king and is entitled maybe in a sense to certain rights, this was something that he never had the right to do, to take another man's wife. And so David recognizes this, and that's why he simply can't just dissolve the marriage, because this is a sin that is worthy of death. So David's got to find a way to cover his sin. So Uriah comes, verse 7, when Uriah had come to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war prospered. Now, David, when he first talks to Uriah, basically wants an update on how the war has progressed. Now, this is something that is not uncommon, right? David, at this time, they don't have the technology that we have today. They don't have any fast communication. Often you had to communicate by sending a messenger. And in this particular case, Uriah, at least what David wants Uriah to think he's doing, David simply wants Uriah to think that he's just coming to give a report from what has happened out on the battlefield. Which in this particular case, from what we know in chapter 10, things are going very well, right? Because we know that the Israelites are going to be victorious. So this is positive news, and I think that's important to keep in mind because of what David then will now request of Uriah. If the Israelites were being defeated pretty soundly, David really wouldn't have any type of excuse to try to keep Uriah back at home, because Uriah's needed to try to help turn the tide of the battle. Some think that Uriah was a pretty high-ranking figure in the military. We don't know that for sure. But, if you think about it, if Israel was being beaten by the Syrians and the Ammonites, Uriah, you need to get back because we cannot lose this war, so to speak. But if things are going well, which we know they are based on chapter 10, then it makes more sense, at least for David, to try to request Uriah to then stay at home, at least in David's mind, right? Because David's trying to justify all these things. And so, David's having to get very creative in a way to try to cover up his sin. And so verse 8, more than likely Uriah reported that there were positive news. So David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. Now basically we know that this statement here in verse 8, connecting it with verse 11, meant, of course, that David wanted Uriah to go into sleep with his wife. Some translate that as refreshing or relaxing, but the idea is what's presented in verse 11. So there's not a whole lot of need to discuss that in detail. But notice again, or at least think about why David would then want this to happen, or at least why David goes about it the way that he does. And certainly we kind of understand, at least in our sense, why David would request Uriah to do this, but there are a couple of other things we need to keep in mind about why David chooses this particular method, and it's based on what we know about in the law of Moses concerning this type of situation. All right, first of all, in your Bibles, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Bless you. Deuteronomy chapter 23. Let's look at verses 9. Let's look at verses 9 through. Let's look at verses 9 through 11. Now, in this chapter, this is talking about basically military protocol when it concerns cleanliness and uncleanliness. Deuteronomy chapter 23, beginning in verse 9. When the army goes out against your enemies, which we saw happen in chapter 10, that's the setting. Israel's fighting against the Ammonites and the Syrians. Then keep yourself from every wicked thing. Now, if you got, I'm reading from the New King James Version, mainly because it's got two Bible markers, so it's easy for me to get to different passages in this Bible. If you've got another word there for wicked, what do you have? Evil. Wicked or evil. Now, in this passage, this is not talking about something that is necessarily sinful. Wicked and evil here is not necessarily talking about something that is sinful. Rather, it's talking about something that could keep you from becoming unclean. And so the point is that when the army goes out against your enemies, when you have set up your camp, then you are to keep yourself from becoming unclean, is the idea. Now, that's not necessarily talking about sin, but it's talking about the idea of becoming physically unclean, according to the law of Moses. Verse 10, if there is any man among you who becomes unclean by some occurrence in the night, then he shall go outside the camp, he shall not come inside the camp. So if you become unclean, you have to separate yourself from the rest of the military. You cannot come back into the camp. That's important for what we read in 2 Samuel 11, as we'll see in a moment. And then verse 11, but it shall be when evening comes that he shall wash with water, and when the sun sets, he may come into the camp. And so when the Israelites went out to war, they were expected to, at least by the law of Moses, to keep themselves clean, to not do anything to get themselves unclean. All right, so keep that rule in mind, because Uriah is in the army, and he is expected to follow through with that. He is expected to keep himself clean. Now, in your Bibles, look at Leviticus chapter 15 and verse 18. Again, also when a woman lies with a man and there is an emission, they shall bathe in water and be unclean until the evening. So what you get from that idea is that when a man slept with his wife, basically both of them became unclean. And so keeping those two things in mind, now when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, David is really asking Uriah not just to go and be with your wife. David's actually asking Uriah to do something that militarily he was never supposed to do. David is basically asking Uriah, not only do you go down and sleep with your wife, but also you're going to have to take some time off from being in the military. You're going to have to neglect your duty as a soldier in God's army, right? Because that's what the Israelites were. They were fighting on behalf of God. And that's what David then is asking Uriah to do. And that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, not only does he give this, but he also, again, gives a gift, right? So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. And perhaps this was a way to try to for David to show his favorability to Uriah, obviously to try to entice Uriah to go to his wife, to take food to his wife, as a way to get Uriah to go home and go through with what David wanted. But notice verse 9, Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. So instead of following through with what David wanted, again, that was a command of the king, Uriah does decide to disobey the king. He sleeps at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, which, from what we're told, within the king's property, there were certain places where the servants stayed. That's where Uriah essentially was staying at, where the other servants would stay. I like the way that somebody put this, and that's the fact that in all of this, Uriah was always on duty. He never forgot what his job was in this time. However, David was the exact opposite. While Uriah was always on duty, ready to do the job asked of him, David was not. Now, you think about in this particular situation. Well, I mean, you think about it in our current time, right? We've all seen videos about soldiers returning home. It's a really big thing. It happens at sporting events. We've seen it happen at schools. Where soldiers return home, they see their kids, they see their loved ones. It's a really big thing, and it's something that I think all of us are happy for, because people go fight and die to protect our freedoms, and they get to come back and be with their loved ones. We like to see when soldiers return home and get to be with their families again. And so for a lot of soldiers, that's the first thing that they want to do when they get back home from war, is to go in to be with their loved ones. It's a natural reaction. But in all of this, Uriah's first inclination when he gets back was not to be with his wife, but to be back with the people of Israel, because the war and the fighting was still going on. The job wasn't done. And so Uriah in all this was still on duty, but on, while the battle's going on, gave into his own personal lust. And so in a sense, David was not on duty, or he was not of the right frame of mind like Uriah was. A really interesting comparison, because David, an Israelite who was born in Israel and the leader of God's people, failed to do the right thing when Uriah, who was a proselyte, he was not from the nation of Israel, in all this was trying to do the right thing. Speaks highly of Uriah, doesn't speak very highly of David. So verse 10, when they told David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house, David calls in Uriah and asks, "Did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" Now, Uriah, perhaps David is surprised by Uriah's disobedience. Again, David did give him this command, but Uriah chose not to follow through with it. But notice what Uriah thus says in verse 11. Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." Basically, Uriah's response is, "What right do I have to sit back and relax?" Now, this is really interesting what Uriah says in verse 11, especially this first phrase. He says that the ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Now, the reason why that phrase is so interesting, because it basically reminds us of something that David had said earlier in his life. Look for a moment at Psalm chapter 132 in verses 2 through 5. Psalm 132 in verses 2 through 5. Dad, if you would read that for us.
"Surely I will not come into the tabernacle of my house, nor go up into my bed. I will not give sleep to mine eyes, or slumber to mine eyelids, until I find out a place for the Lord, and habitation for the mighty God of Jacob."
So what is this a reference to? If I'm not mistaken, this is a reference to the temple, right? Remember what David, if you look back at 2 Samuel chapter 7, remember 2 Samuel chapter 7, David looks around about in his nice house that he had built when he captured Jerusalem. And remember that he said to Nathan, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 2, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells inside tent curtains." And so in that passage, David felt guilty for being in a nice place, or for dwelling in a nice house, while God was dwelling in a temporary tabernacle that was not nearly as nicely furnished as what David had. I find that interesting because when you think about that and you think about what Uriah says in 2 Samuel 11, verse 11, what he's saying is not all that different than what David had said when it came to the building of the temple. Because Uriah said the ark in Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents. You might have the word booths, but the word there for booths means tents. So in other words, Uriah feels guilty for dwelling outside the king's house where he has provisions given to him, while the ark of God and the men of Judah that are fighting are dwelling in tents. Their condition, at least in condition of war, it's not as nice as living back home. So Uriah feels guilty about staying at home while the other men are gone to war. And no doubt, when Uriah says this, you almost wonder if it didn't trigger, David to remember what he said to Nathan back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 when it came to the construction of the temple. And so Uriah's response, of course, then, "Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." For Uriah to go and to dwell, or at least to go back and to sleep with his wife, this would have meant that he would not have been able to fight for about 2 days. When he first called in Uriah, and Uriah went and slept with his wife that night, because of how the Jewish day works, he would have been unclean up through 6 p.m. to the next day, at least until, and at that point, that's when night begins. And so typically they're not going to do any fighting at night. So the whole next day, Uriah would not have been able to go and to be able to fight and to help the Israelites out. This is not just a one-night thing that what David is requesting of him. This is a multiple day. This is something that would have kept Uriah out of the army for multiple days, based on what we've already seen in Deuteronomy 23 and Leviticus chapter 15. And so Uriah's response is, I'm absolutely not going to do this, because while there are other people working, I'm not going to sit back and kick back and relax. Now you think about what Uriah is saying it from a practical sense from our perspective. Most people, I think a lot of people feel guilty watching somebody work, and they themselves are not working, if you get what I'm saying. There's some people that work, that hold two jobs. Some families work that way. You've got one spouse that's working, holding two jobs. The other part, or the other spouse in that relationship, isn't hardly doing any type of work. And I think for most of us, that would make us kind of mad that that's how it works in that household. Because we like to see, typically, at least today, there's work for both spouses, at least in a physical sense, in a marriage. Whether that's working at the home or working outside the home. Either way, each spouse is supposed to pull their fair share. And sometimes we get upset when we see, again, people that are working, sometimes working two different jobs to provide for a household when the other spouse isn't doing anything at all. And that frustrates us and gets on our anger, gets our anger riled up. Sort of the same way that, some people get upset with, there are people that can work, they're on disability, they can work, but they choose not to work. It makes people that work really hard upset just because, they can go out and work. It doesn't make us feel good. That's the same sense that Uriah is getting at here. Now, we think about it in a practical sense. We think about this too in a spiritual sense. When it comes to the work of the church is not supposed to be carried out by a small percentage of the congregation. It is expected to be carried out by each individual. Now, some may have more responsibilities than others, but when you look at churches that were doing what they should, as we're going to be talking about in the book of Revelation, the churches that Jesus would commend of those 7 churches of Asia, and I believe 2 that he particularly commends and doesn't say anything negative about. Part of the reason why you can commend those congregations is because everybody was working together. Nobody was cutting back on the slack, and nobody was relying on somebody else to carry their workload for them. Uriah has the same mindset. I have no right to sit back and relax while there are others that are working, basically where I need to be also working, at least in this case, fighting against the enemies of Israel. With that being said, are there any comments on what we've talked about up through verse 12?
Paul spoke of saints in Caesar's household. In other words, to us, it was amazing that you would find faith in them. And I guess, in a sense, we find it amazing that there's that much faith in Uriah,
Right.
who, as you said, is not even really a Jew. He's just attached to Judaism. And for him to tell the king, there at the end of verse 11, I will not.
Right.
When you're bucking the highest man in the land, that's a lot of faith to be able to do that. He said no to David and yes to God is what it is.
Yeah, he's saying yes to the law of God rather than to the command of David. Because, again, we saw what the law of God was, that if you are a soldier, you are not supposed to do anything to make yourself unclean when the army is encamped and in the process of fighting another enemy. Now, sometimes that could accidentally happen, sickness or something like that. But to knowingly make yourself unclean, like Uriah would have had to do, that would have been Uriah defying the law of God, and Uriah chose to follow God rather than David. So he has the right to say, "I will not do this thing." Now, most time kings would be really upset and would want the person to defy them to be punished, but David instead doesn't do that. And I always kind of wonder, is that because David is, if David had a certain recognition that what Uriah was getting at is what David understood. So I always wonder if when Uriah says this, David is reminded of Deuteronomy 23, where Uriah is making that point that the law of God says, I can't make myself unclean. So instead of David being really upset, perhaps it's a reminder of David about the law of God. But the point is, in verse 12, David's still not going to stop when it comes to trying to cover up his sin. He says to Uriah, wait here today also, and tomorrow I will let you depart. And so Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now when David called him, he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. So Uriah, in a right frame of mind, will not go down to sleep with his wife. So David's answer now is, well, we've got to get him drunk to go in to lie with his wife. But the problem for David is Uriah doesn't do that. Now, one thing that I'll point out here, the reason why the Bible focuses on drunkenness in the passages that it does, the whole point is, part of the whole point of it is that as Christians we have a tough enough time as it is in our right frame of mind dealing with the problem of sin. And what drunkenness does, at least that's what David is kind of banking on here that Uriah will do, is that Uriah's judgment will slip because he's drunk, and so he would go and do something wrong that in his right frame of mind he would never do. And that's why the Bible puts an emphasis on drunkenness for multiple reasons, but I think most importantly for the fact that it clouds judgment. And the devil, it makes it so much easier for the devil to get us to sin when we have our judgment clouded in that sense. Just like what David is hoping will happen with Uriah here. But notice again that Uriah, nevertheless, did not go down to his house. And so, verse 14 and verse 15, where we're going to close this morning, shows that when it comes to sin, to cover up a particular sin, it often leads into even more sin. It sort of is a downward slope. So verse 14, in the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and retreat from him, that he may be struck down and die. So the first two attempts don't work, and so the third attempt is David basically saying that we can kind of cleverly disguise Uriah's death by sending him back into battle and allowing him to then die. Now, something that is very interesting to me in all of this is that David sends Uriah's death note to Joab in the hand of Uriah. So, I mean, you almost think about it, because obviously David's not going to tell Uriah what the contents of this letter are. Again, kings would often seal their letters to keep them from being read. But you think about what David's doing here. David is sending Uriah back to the military with his own death sentence. And that's something that, you know, we've seen a lot of the good in David, but that's something that is just a very cold, to me, is a very cold-hearted thing. Certainly murder is a cold-blooded thing, but to send at least to send the murder note or murder message, or however you want to put it, to send that message by the man that you are hoping to be killed is a very cold-blooded thing. And I like the way that this one writer puts this when it concerns David and Uriah in verses 14 and 15. And I'll just read you what he says. He says that David is counting on the fact that Uriah, as a loyal soldier, will not dream of opening the letter. If he does not know of the adultery, he has in any case no personal motive to look at the letter. If he does know, he is accepting his fate with grim resignation, bitterly conscious that his wife has betrayed him and that the king is too powerful for him to contend with. And I think that's an interesting way of sort of wrapping this confrontation between David and Uriah up. David is giving this letter to Uriah, trusting that he will not open the letter to read the contents of it. You think about if you're given a letter from the president to deliver to somebody, there's going to be a great temptation to open that letter to see what the president's talking about. But David's putting a lot of faith in Uriah to not open that letter. But if Uriah, and some may think that Uriah might have noticed that something was up, if Uriah and somehow had figured out about the adultery, there's not a lot that Uriah could do at this point. And so Uriah decides to go and to deliver the letter, knowing that the contents of the letter could spell harm for him. But we don't know for sure whether he knew or not. That was just an interesting thing that a commentator pointed out. But the point that we get to by the end of verse 15 is that when it comes to sin and trying to cover up sin, it typically leads into a progress, or it leads into a downward progress of decline for any individual. And most notably in this case of David, who has been righteous on a lot of things, but when you commit one sin, it often leads you to commit other sins to try to cover up the original sin. And ultimately, that does not work out well for anyone, as we see that it won't work out for David in chapter 12. All right, with that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what or where we're wrapping up this morning?
To me, this reminds us of the mercy of God and the grace of God. Even though David does all this and it is wrong, he will repent, and he will be forgiven.
Right.
He will be forgiven of all this.
Right.
Because of God's grace.
Right, absolutely. All right, we'll stop there for this morning. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. We'll pick up in 2 Samuel 11 and verse 16, Lord willing, next Sunday morning.